You look at Tolkien, and at the end of the books, Sauron has been defeated, Aragorn is king, and Tolkien just says, and he ruled wisely and well for 500 years or whatever. And it's easy to type, he ruled wisely and well. But then you start asking yourself, what does that constitute, ruling wisely and well? I mean, what was his tax policy? Uh, how did the economy function, under him? Did he encourage trade? Did he discourage it? What about the class system? The rising uh, peasantry and the burgeoning middle class. Was those encouraged or put down? Did he give power to the aristocracy? The orcs. There are still tens, thousands of orcs left over at the end of Lord of the Rings. Did he pursue a policy of genocide toward them, or did he reach out to try to educate the orcs and bring them into the mainstream and civilize them? We never get answers to any of these questions. We just get he rules wisely and well. What I've tried to do in showing rulers as diverse as Robert and Ned Stark and Cersei Lannister and Daenerys Targaryen is show people who achieve a position of power, and then what do they do with it?
George R. R. Martin, the author of A Game of Thrones, speaks about the differences between his books and those of Tolkien, A Lord of the Rings. George R. R. Martin's stories largely focus on political strife and power struggles. When referring to The Lord of the Rings, George R. R. Martin says, "What was Aragorn's tax policy?" In The Lord of the Rings, it states that Aragorn ruled wisely and well. And George R. R. Martin asks, what does that constitute exactly? Did J.R.R. Tolkien fail to demonstrate Aragorn's wisdom, to show his grace and mercy as a leader? And are there perhaps much more fundamental flaws in Tolkien's work? Recently, Razorfist posted on Twitter, "Every writer has strong points and weak points. Tolkien had a poetic command of describing nature, atmosphere, heroism, not so much of the romance, or battle, or conversation. Modern readers are weaned on the latter and starved of the former." It sounds like Razorfist is saying that J.R.R. Tolkien is bad at writing battle, romance, and conversation. Maybe he doesn't suck at those things, but he's at least not very good at those, at least compared to his ability to write heroism, atmosphere, and nature. Razorfist is also saying that modern readers like romance, battle, and conversation, but they aren't being given a poetic command of nature, atmosphere, and heroism. When I first saw this tweet, it kind of made me chuckle a bit. To me, it sounds like this is someone who just watched the movies a few times and then out of curiosity was interested to see what the books were like. Yes, watching the Battle of Helm's Deep is far more entertaining on a widescreen with surround sound than it is while you're reading it in a book. Movies are a special medium because they're moving. That's why they're called movies. It needs to have a lot of motion, action. It needs to be visually captivating. In the movie theater, once they hit the play button, there's no stopping it. The film's rolling. Whereas in a book, the speed of events is not fixed, and it will vary from reader to reader. Everybody reads at their own pace. Books rely solely on words, thoughts, and feelings. This means you can have lots of introspection. You can focus a lot more on the thoughts of the characters, their dialogue, and also rely more heavily on narration. That's something you can't do in a movie. But books have their limitations too. You can make a battle brimming with action, but no matter how well you write it, the same battle would always be far more entertaining if it was on a TV screen or in a comic book. But at the end of the day, J.R.R. Tolkien wasn't trying to write a thriller. The point of The Lord of the Rings isn't battle and war. The Lord of the Rings wasn't meant to be Conan. In fact, I would go on to say that The Lord of the Rings has less in common with most fantasy stories, including the Game of Thrones, as it does with ancient Germanic sagas like Beowulf or the Volsung Saga. I'm not just saying that just because of a lot of similar elements between the two stories. The Volsung Saga also focuses on a ring of power which corrupts people, the shattered sword of a king that must be reforged by his heir, or the gray-haired wandering wizard who lends his aid to the heroes. Structurally, both stories rely heavily on poems. In fact, the Germanic sagas were poems. Many of the ancient literary devices used by these Germanic peoples are echoed in Tolkien's work. Bilbo refers to himself as the barrel rider. This is called a kenning. Instead of referring to a person or a concept's literal name, you create a euphemism stringing several words together. Instead of saying the ocean, I could say the whale's road. You could say, I sailed across the ocean. Or you could say, I fared upon the whale's road. Which one sounds more interesting? While Bilbo confronts Smaug and Gollum, he engages them in a battle of riddles. This reminds me of the interchange between King Gilfy and High Justice High and Third in the Gylfaginning. It also reminds me of the interchange between the King Hythric and Getsamblindi, who is actually Odin in disguise. The ancient Germanic sagas certainly featured action. There were battles, wars, and violent conflicts with other mythical creatures. But the sagas never actually showed the gritty details of war. These stories were all written in the third person, not candidly showing the first-person view of someone locked in deadly combat. These stories also weren't really focused on individuals, but on families. The Volsung saga spans several generations. It explains how this family gained prominence, fell, and then was redeemed, and then eventually destroyed. Similarly, the story of The Lord of the Rings is also a generational one. The story of Frodo begins with his uncle Bilbo, and the story of Aragorn starts with the Isildur. When Beowulf goes to help King Hrothgar fight against Grendel and Grendel's mother, he is actually paying a debt which his father had owed to Hrothgar's family. The focus of this story isn't the gritty action which ensued as he locked himself in deadly combat with Grendel and Grendel's mom. The focus was a generational obligation, that Beowulf had the honor to fulfill it, and that he showed no fear in the face of death. What makes the battle between Grendel and Beowulf so interesting is that Beowulf doesn't just kill him with strength, but also with ingenuity. You see, Grendel couldn't be harmed by a human weapon, so Beowulf just uses his hands to tear Grendel's arm off. The battle isn't explained with intimate detail, and it wasn't meant to be. The story isn't told in a fixed visual medium, leaving lots of room for the listener or reader to imagine what was happening, to fill in the blanks. Generally, books are a lot more drawn out than movies, but I'm guessing you could actually probably read The Battle of Helm's Deep faster than you could watch it. When I see people like Razorfist say that J.R.R. Tolkien isn't very good at writing battles, I'm guessing he probably just saw the movie, and yes, The Battle of Helm's Deep was really cool, and so he had a certain expectation of The Battle of Helm's Deep to be focused on a lot more on these gritty details, kind of like the movie, and also be very drawn out, but that wasn't the actual purpose behind The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings wasn't written to be an action book or a thriller. And while J.R.R. Tolkien didn't live to see his books adapted by Peter Jackson, there's some people who know J.R.R. Tolkien who talked about how he most likely would have reacted. John Erzad, who knew J.R.R. Tolkien, though he does give the disclaimer that he didn't really know him super intimately, talks about how he felt that Tolkien would have reacted to the films. John said, "The retired Oxford professor I know would first have to spend a day massaging his ears after a 3-hour assault from the bells, death cries, and crashing of swords against helmets and highly amplified soundtrack. His great-grandchildren would have broken it gently to him that this is now utterly normal in any fiction film aimed at the youth market." Christopher Tolkien, his son and editor who helped posthumously publish some of his work, had some very harsh things to say about how J.R.R. Tolkien would have felt about the movies. He said, "They gutted the book, making an action movie for 15 to 25-year-olds, and it seems that The Hobbit will be the same ilk." Tolkien became devoured by his popularity and absorbed by the absurdity of time. The gap widened between the beauty, the seriousness of the work, and what it has become is beyond me. This level of marketing reduces the aesthetic and philosophical significance of this work to nothing. Now, this was taken from an interview which he did with a French newspaper and was translated from French. So if you've seen this quote before, but with some slight variations in the language, that's why. Here we have 2 examples of people who knew Tolkien who talked about how he most likely wouldn't have liked the movies. The focus of these films is intense action, but that wasn't the focus of the books. The books were written with a different intention. They are in essence a modern-day saga, possibly even intended to be interpreted as a pseudo-history. George R. R. Martin sort of criticized J.R.R. Tolkien for just telling people that Aragorn was a good leader without actually showing it. He also raises a question as to whether Aragorn would have committed genocide or not, and he really wanted to know the very nitty-gritty of Aragorn's tax policy, of how he'd run his economy. Lord of the Rings isn't intended to be a lesson on macro and microeconomics. It's also not about political intrigue either. The Lord of the Rings also isn't just action. It isn't meant to be a thriller. It's a modern saga, and perhaps an alternative history as to what actually happened in the Germanic sagas. That those are perhaps just stories which have been corrupted with time. So was Aragorn some type of genocidal maniac? Was he a tyrant? Why didn't J.R.R. Tolkien actually show him being a good and competent leader? Well, I actually disagree with George R.R. Martin's assessment there. Shortly after Aragorn is appointed to be king, we get to see how he interacts with other people. We see this on a micro and on a macro level. The peoples of the east and south, which had worked with Sauron, sent emissaries to Aragorn shortly after his coronation. He pardoned the Easterlings. He also made peace with the southern-dwelling people of Harad. He also gave the slaves of Mordor clemency and granted them the lands which surrounded the Sea of Nirn. These actions demonstrate Aragorn's leadership. Rather than just seeking revenge, he wanted to listen to people who came to him in peace. He was merciful, and also a visionary leader, as it seems he's trying to develop a similar long-term relationship with the people who would inhabit the lands of Nirn as the one that had been developed with the people of Rohan, providing Gondor with a long-term ally. Another example of Aragorn's leadership is the judgment he ends up pronouncing on Beregond. Pippin learns that Denethor is planning on burning Faramir. Pippin warns Beregond, who is at watch at the Citadel's gate. He deserts his post and attempts to rescue Faramir. Beregond is impeded by several guards. He is either to let Faramir die or to kill them so he can pass. He ends up deciding to save Faramir, but of course after the war, this causes a lot of controversy. Some people are very angry with Beregond, others feel he made the right decision. Aragorn explains that Beregond's actions are punishable by death, and he assumes that he's going to be executed. Instead, however, Aragorn decides to only banish him from the city of Minas Tirith, and then appoint him to serve beneath Faramir. So he didn't get off scot-free, and since he demonstrated such a loyalty to Faramir, it's best to put him under Faramir's stewardship. Saving Faramir was a great deed, but at the same time it had a very big cost, and so he must not be permitted to enter into the city of Minas Tirith again. Which is why Beregond kissed Aragorn's hand and was grateful for his mercy but also his justice. We also see his great humility as well, as he has Frodo the Hobbit bring him the crown which Gandalf shall place upon his head. While George R.R. Martin may feel that J.R. Tolkien failed to demonstrate Aragorn's ability as a king and a leader, I disagree with him. Unlike The Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings wasn't written to talk about political intrigue in autistic detail. Again, it's a modern epic, and while Razorfist feels that J.R. Tolkien fails at writing battles, I disagree with him as well. Lord of the Rings wasn't intended for the sole purpose of creating high-octane action. One of my favorite battles in the book is when Merry and Pippin are caught in the crossfire between the orcs and the riders of Rohan. These two little hobbits have no idea if they're going to make it out alive or what's even going on. Their confusion is amplified by the darkness of night. We get to listen to their thoughts as stampeding horses crash against the orcs and death is rained upon them. In terms of narrative, this battle in many ways is actually more important than the one that happened at Helm's Deep. It shows us how small these hobbits are in comparison to these giant problems which are swarming around them. How much of a sacrifice it was for them to come on this journey, and we see up front how frightening war can be. J.R. Tolkien isn't bad at writing battles, but if you're using the films as a yardstick to measure his books, then you're going to be disappointed. The Lord of the Rings isn't just about action, it's also not about political intrigue. Again, it's a modern epic. If you would like to intimately understand the Lord of the Rings, you're going to need to intimately understand the Germanic Sagas. You'll have to dissect Beowulf and the Volsung Saga. This is a secret about Lord of the Rings that everyone seems to be missing.